The sun was cruel that day, hanging low over the Arizona dust. The woman's hands were cuffed in front of her, skin raw where the rope had rubbed, a prisoner freshly arrived from the Pacific Theater. She stood before a group of American soldiers in Stetsons, their boots caked in red earth, their silence louder than any scream. She braced for mockery, for punishment, for pain. But then one of them stepped forward, lean, quiet, mustache catching the sweat. His boots stopped inches from hers. He tilted his hat back, looked her in the eye, and said just 3 words, "Ma'am, you're safe." Lieutenant Keiko Tanaka had served 2 years as an Imperial Army nurse in the South Pacific. She'd set bones under artillery fire, triaged wounded soldiers in makeshift jungle hospitals, and watched young men die whispering for their mothers. When American forces overran her field hospital near Saipan in June 1944, she expected execution. The training had been explicit. Americans took no prisoners. They desecrated bodies. They showed no mercy to women. Better to end your own life with dignity than face what awaited in enemy hands. But the bullets never came. Instead came zip ties, a blindfold, and the deafening roar of transport planes. Days blurred into interrogation rooms and medical checks. She refused to speak, refused to eat. When they told her she was being sent to a detention facility in the American Southwest, she closed her eyes and prepared for whatever hell awaited. The other nurses whispered that torture came slowly in America, psychological, designed to break the spirit before the body. Keiko steeled herself. She would give them nothing. Not her voice, not her fear, not her tears. The camp at Florence, Arizona, materialized like a mirage through the truck's canvas flap. Rows of barracks surrounded by wire, guard towers stabbing the sky, and heat that made breathing feel like swallowing sand. She was pulled from the vehicle with 14 other Japanese prisoners, all military personnel, all trained to expect brutality. They stood in formation as the American soldiers approached. This was the moment. This was when the cruelty would begin. But Guard Corporal James Jimmy Hartwell from Amarillo, Texas, did something no one anticipated. He removed his hat, wiped his brow, and looked at the exhausted woman before him not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, not as something less than human, but as someone who needed help. "Ma'am, you're safe," he said, his voice steady and soft. Then he gestured toward the shade. "Let's get you out of this sun." Keiko's knees nearly buckled. Not from weakness, but from shock. "Ma'am," the word rattled through her mind like a stone in an empty can. "Ma'am," a term of respect, of courtesy, of recognition. It was impossible. Everything she'd been taught, everything she believed about this moment, shattered by 3 words spoken in a Texan drawl under an unforgiving sky. Imperial military indoctrination had been thorough, methodical, and absolute. From the moment Keiko entered nursing training in 1941, the message was hammered home: surrender equals dishonor. Death equals dignity. Capture equals unspeakable suffering. The instructors showed films, propaganda reels depicting American soldiers as savage, cruel, subhuman. They told stories of prisoners tortured, humiliated, defiled. "Better to die fighting," they repeated, "than to fall into enemy hands alive." Keiko had internalized every word. When evacuation became impossible during the Saipan invasion, and American troops breached the hospital perimeter, she'd reached for the grenade in her medical kit. Her fingers had actually closed around it. But a younger nurse, barely 19, had grabbed her wrist, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the stories weren't entirely true. Maybe survival was worth the risk. In that split second of hesitation, American soldiers burst through the tent flap, weapons raised, shouting in English. Keiko had frozen, waiting for the end. It never came. Instead came orders she didn't understand, gestures toward the ground, and eventually rough but not violent handling as they zip-tied her wrists. No beatings, no executions, just efficiency, protocol, and an almost bureaucratic indifference. It was deeply unsettling. Where was the savagery? Where was the hatred? The Americans treated them like logistics, problems to be processed, documented, transported. It didn't match anything she'd been promised. The other captured nurses whispered theories during transport. Perhaps the cruelty came later. Perhaps this was psychological warfare, lull them into false security before the real torture began. Perhaps the camps in America were where the propaganda became reality. Keiko said nothing. She watched the Americans carefully, studying their faces, their body language, their casual interactions with each other. They joked. They complained about the heat. They shared cigarettes. They seemed ordinary. Tired young men far from home, just like the soldiers she'd treated. But that meant the training was wrong. If the training was wrong about American soldiers being monsters, what else was wrong? If surrender didn't immediately lead to torture, what other lies had been embedded in her worldview? The questions were dangerous. They undermined everything. So Keiko pushed them away, clinging to what she knew. She was a prisoner. They were enemies. Nothing good could come from this. Then Jimmy Hartwell called her ma'am, and the whole fragile structure collapsed, because that single word contained multitudes. It acknowledged her humanity. It granted her dignity. It treated her not as defeated enemy or war criminal, but as a woman deserving basic respect. In that moment, standing in the Arizona heat with dust coating her throat and shame heavy in her chest, Keiko Tanaka faced a terrible realization. She had been lied to. Systematically, deliberately, completely. And if they lied about this, about the fundamental nature of the enemy, what else wasn't true? What had she believed that was merely propaganda? What had she sacrificed for narratives that crumbled at the first encounter with reality? The questions broke something inside her, and for the first time since capture, Lieutenant Keiko Tanaka allowed herself to cry. James Hartwell never intended to become a prison guard. He'd been a ranch hand before Pearl Harbor, spending his days mending fences and breaking horses under the enormous Texas sky. The Army needed bodies, so Jimmy enlisted, expecting to end up in Europe or the Pacific carrying a rifle. Instead, his superiors noticed his temperament, steady, patient, unflappable, and assigned him to Camp Florence as a guard for enemy prisoners of war. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic, but it was necessary. Jimmy's father had taught him a simple philosophy. Treat everyone like they're carrying something heavy you can't see. It wasn't sophisticated ethics or lofty principle, just common decency learned from years of small-town life where everyone knew everyone's business and grudges destroyed communities. When Jimmy saw the Japanese prisoners arrive that August afternoon, sunburned and exhausted and terrified, he didn't see enemies. He saw people who'd lost. People far from home. People who probably wanted to be there about as much as he wanted to be standing in 110-degree heat wearing wool. The other guards had different approaches. Some were coldly professional, following protocol to the letter without unnecessary interaction. Others carried visible anger. Brothers killed at Guadalcanal, friends who died at Pearl Harbor, rage that needed a target. Jimmy understood the anger. He'd lost his cousin at Midway. But he'd also watched his father nurse a wounded coyote back to health, even though coyotes killed calves, because suffering was suffering, and mercy didn't require approval. So when Lieutenant Tanaka stepped from the truck, swaying slightly, clearly in distress, Jimmy's instinct was simple: help. Ma'am, your safe wasn't a political statement or tactical decision. It was just true. She was safe. The United States had signed the Geneva Conventions. Camp Florence, despite its isolation and harsh conditions, followed the rules. Prisoners received medical care, adequate food, protection from abuse. They weren't tortured. They weren't executed. They were detained, yes. Guarded, yes. But treated according to international law. Jimmy figured she probably didn't know that. Figured she was probably scared out of her mind. Figured the least he could do was tell her the truth in plain language. What Jimmy didn't expect was the reaction. Lieutenant Tanaka stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. Her eyes, dark and exhausted and carrying weights he couldn't imagine, went wide. Her breath caught. For a moment he thought she might collapse, and he instinctively reached out to steady her, then thought better of it. Don't touch prisoners without cause. Protocol existed for good reasons. Instead, he just gestured again toward the shade and the water station, speaking slowly and clearly. Let's get you somewhere cool. Medical check first, then orientation. You'll be okay. Later, after the prisoners were processed and settled into their assigned barracks, Jimmy's commanding officer pulled him aside. Captain Morrison was career Army, by the book, but not unkind. "Good work today, Hartwell," he said. "That Japanese nurse, Tanaka, she's talking now, cooperating with medical staff. Translator says she keeps repeating something about respect." "Something you said?" Jimmy shrugged, genuinely confused. He'd just done what seemed obvious. Treat people decently. Use basic manners. Acknowledge their humanity. It wasn't complicated, but Morrison smiled slightly, a rare expression on his weathered face. "Keep doing whatever you're doing, Corporal. We win more cooperation with small kindnesses than we ever would with intimidation." Jimmy nodded, not fully understanding. He was just a cowboy from Amarillo doing his job. He had no idea that 3 words spoken in genuine concern would ripple outward through that camp, changing everything. News traveled fast in prisoner barracks. Within hours, every Japanese detainee at Camp Florence knew about the American guard who'd called Lieutenant Tanaka ma'am. The reaction was mixed, complex, and ultimately transformative. Some dismissed it as manipulation, American psychological tactics, softened them up before the real cruelty began. Others saw it as an anomaly, one kind guard among many brutal ones. But a few, a growing few, began to wonder if perhaps the entire framework they'd been given about capture was fundamentally flawed. Private First Class Hiroshi Yamada had been captured alongside Tanaka at Saipan. He'd served as a medical orderly, barely 20 years old, expecting to die honorably in service to the Emperor. When American Marines took him alive, he'd wept with shame. His family would never recover from the dishonor. But watching the Americans in the weeks since capture, he'd noticed troubling contradictions. They gave him clean water. They treated an infected wound on his leg. They didn't beat him for refusing to answer questions. And now this, an American guard treating their lieutenant with respect typically reserved for officers. It didn't compute. Hiroshi began quietly observing the American guards. Not all were like Hartwell. Some were distant, others gruff, a few clearly bitter, but none were the savage monsters from the propaganda films. They followed rules. They had procedures. When one prisoner collapsed from heat stroke, the guards immediately called for medical assistance and carried him to the infirmary themselves. When another prisoner became agitated and violent, they restrained but didn't brutalize him. It was also bureaucratic, clinical, professional, as if they were simply doing jobs rather than exacting revenge on defeated enemies. Lieutenant Tanaka, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own crisis of belief. She'd agreed to cooperate with camp medical staff, not because of coercion, but because Corporal Hartwell's simple kindness had created space for reconsideration. If they treated her with basic human dignity, perhaps she owed them basic human honesty. She began translating during medical examinations, helping explain symptoms and treatments to other prisoners who spoke no English. She answered factual questions about Japanese military medical procedures. Nothing tactical, nothing that could endanger anyone, just technical information about how field hospitals operated. Other prisoners noticed. Some accused her of collaboration, of betraying the Emperor, of choosing survival over honor. But others saw something different. They saw a woman who'd been shown unexpected kindness and responded in kind. They saw a demonstration that perhaps the rigid hierarchies and absolute demands of military indoctrination weren't the only way to exist, even in captivity. They saw a small crack forming in the wall of certainty that had defined their entire worldview. The real shift came 3 weeks after arrival. A young Japanese pilot, shot down over Guam and captured, attempted suicide in his cell. Guards found him in time, and the camp medical staff, including Lieutenant Tanaka as translator, stabilized him. But afterward, Corporal Hartwell sat with the pilot for hours, not interrogating, just sitting. The pilot later told Hiroshi through tears that the American had simply stayed present, a silent acknowledgement that someone cared whether he lived or died. Not for intelligence value, not for propaganda, just because human life mattered. The pilot began eating again, started speaking, eventually started sketching the Arizona landscape through the barbed wire, finding something beautiful, even in captivity. The silence that had defined their arrival, The defensive, terrified refusal to engage began to shatter, not through force, but through consistent, quiet, unglamorous human decency. 3 words had started it. But what followed was something far more profound, the slow, painful, liberating realization that enemies could choose to be human to each other, even in war. Keiko Tanaka returned to Japan in 1946, part of the massive prisoner repatriation following surrender. She carried no physical scars from her time at Camp Florence, a fact that itself was remarkable. But she carried something else, a small notebook where she'd written down English phrases, including those 3 words that had changed everything. "Ma'am, you're safe." She kept it for the rest of her life. Post-war Japan was chaos. Cities destroyed, economy shattered, millions displaced. Keiko returned to nursing, working in hospitals overwhelmed by wounded soldiers, displaced civilians, and the endless aftermath of catastrophe. She never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner. The shame of capture still carried social stigma in Japanese society, and many former POWs lived quietly, hiding their wartime experiences even from family. But in her practice, colleagues noticed something different about Lieutenant Tanaka. She treated every patient, rich or poor, former soldier or civilian, collaborator or resistance, with the same careful dignity. "Everyone deserves respect," she would say simply when asked about her philosophy. "Everyone is carrying something heavy you cannot see." It wasn't until 1982 that Keiko finally shared her story. A historian researching American POW camps tracked her down through military records, requesting an interview. She was 62 years old, retired, finally ready to speak. The historian asked about conditions at Camp Florence, the food, the treatment, the protocols. Keiko answered factually, confirming that American camps largely followed Geneva Convention standards. Then the historian asked if any particular moment stood out. Keiko was quiet for a long time. Finally, she described that first day, the heat, the fear, and the cowboy guard who called her ma'am. She paused, then added, "In that moment, I stopped being an enemy and became a person again. I had forgotten I could be both a prisoner and a human being." He reminded me, the historian eventually published a book documenting American treatment of Japanese POWs during World War II. Keiko's testimony became a central element, challenging simplistic narratives about wartime behavior on both sides. The book noted that while atrocities certainly occurred, war brings out humanity's worst alongside its best. Institutional policy in American camps emphasized adherence to international law, not because Americans were inherently more moral, but because the military command recognized that treating prisoners humanely served strategic purposes. Prisoners who felt safe cooperated more readily. Prisoners treated with dignity were less likely to resist violently, and documented humane treatment provided moral high ground in a war fought partly through propaganda. Kindness, it turned out, was tactically sound. But for Keiko, it was never about strategy. It was about the moment when doctrine collapsed and revealed something truer underneath, that humans could choose compassion even when circumstances didn't require it. James Hartwell never got promoted for his kindness, never received commendation. He returned to Texas after the war, went back to ranching, raised 4 children, and died in 1989, never knowing that a Japanese nurse had carried his words across the Pacific and into the rest of her life. But Keiko knew, and when she established a small scholarship fund for nursing students in 1985, she named it in English, the Safe Harbor Fund. The application required no essay about heroism or achievement, just a simple statement about how the applicant planned to show dignity to vulnerable people. Because dignity, Keiko had learned in the Arizona desert, costs nothing and changes everything. She died in 2003 at age 83, surrounded by family, her small notebook with its English phrases tucked into her hospital bedside table. Her daughter found it while sorting through belongings and asked what it meant. Keiko's granddaughter, who spoke fluent English, read the pages aloud. When she reached "Ma'am, you're safe," the family fell quiet. They'd never heard this story, never knew about the American Guard or the moment that had defined their grandmother's entire approach to care and compassion. The granddaughter carefully translated everything, and for the first time, Keiko's family understood the source of the quiet kindness that had characterized her life. 3 words, spoken by a cowboy guard to a terrified prisoner under a merciless sun, had echoed across continents and decades, proof that in the midst of humanity's darkest chapters, small acts of recognition and respect could survive.